They thought they had finally found his weakness, not through sanctions, not through border closures, not through power cuts, through the man sitting right beside him. Ibrahim Traoré had survived everything Tinubu threw at West Africa's most defiant government. ECOWAS pressure, French lobbying, economic strangulation, none of it broke him. So the playbook changed. If you cannot break the leader, break the circle around him. Find the most trusted man, the one who sits in every meeting, the one who knows every state secret, the one whose loyalty the president never thinks to question. Buy him, and watch the fortress collapse from inside. Colonel Mamadou Diabaté was that man. National Security Advisor, brother in arms, 3 years of shared resistance against colonial pressure, 3 years of standing together while the West tried every weapon it had, and all along, he was the weapon they had already deployed. When the intercepted recordings hit Traoré's desk, the air in that room changed forever. Diabaté's voice, calm and calculated, coordinating Burkina Faso's economic surrender with Abuja executives. Tinubu's operatives on the line confirming the next phase. Gold reserves, mining rights, cabinet transcripts, all of it handed over. The president suspects nothing. That was what Diabaté said. The president suspects nothing. Traoré suspected everything now. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. This was not a random act of corruption. That is what made it so dangerous. Diabaté was not just taking money on the side. He was the centerpiece of a coordinated operation designed to dismantle Burkina Faso's resistance from within. The recordings revealed it layer by layer. Phase 1, isolate Burkina Faso through ECOWAS sanctions. Phase 2, compromise the inner circle through targeted payments and promises. Phase 3, use the compromised advisor to shift presidential policy toward accommodation. Then, once dependency was established, force compliance or threaten economic collapse. This was regime change without a single bullet. And it had almost worked. The intelligence photographs spread across Traoré's desk told the full story. Diabaté shaking hands with Abuja executives in Dubai. Diabaté meeting Tinubu's economic coordinator in Lagos. Bank transfers moving through shell companies registered in London. And not just passive reporting. Diabaté had been actively shaping Traoré's thinking. Every moment of presidential doubt, every strategic hesitation, every policy debate about foreign investment. The traitor had been steering those conversations, gently, consistently, surgically. This was not just espionage. This was psychological warfare disguised as loyal counsel. Traoré had faced French pressure and survived. He had faced ECOWAS sanctions and refused to bow. He had expelled Western military bases and absorbed the backlash. But this, a man who had sworn an oath beside him, who had sat through classified briefings and national security discussions, who had spoken of African dignity in public while selling it in private, this was the cut that went deepest. Because that is how the colonial machine has always operated at its most sophisticated. Not with gunboats, not with governors in pith helmets. With a handshake, a suitcase, and a face that looks like yours. They did it to Lumumba. They found Mobutu, placed him close enough to trust, and turned him into the instrument of Congo's destruction. They did it to Sankara. They used Compaoré, the man who slept under the same roof, who shared the same revolutionary fire, or so everyone believed. Decades later, different continent, different names, same architecture. Find someone inside, buy their future. Burn down the resistance from the center. But the recordings revealed something Tinubu had not anticipated. He had been recorded too. Traoré's resistance is stronger than expected. Tinubu's voice captured on an intercepted secure line. The sanctions failed, the power pressure failed, the border strategy failed. We need him broken from within. Abuja's response was cold and precise. Our man has delivered everything. Geological surveys, security protocols, cabinet meeting records. Once we control the goldfields, the economy becomes dependent. When that happens, Traoré's resistance becomes a luxury he cannot afford. And then Tinubu laughed. And when he tries to resist, we'll have his own national security advisor testifying that the mining deals are essential for Burkina Faso's stability. The man will destroy his own president's credibility. That was the real plan. Not just to extract gold, to use Diabaté as a public witness against Traoré's sovereign economic policy, to make the betrayal look like wisdom, to make the surrender look like pragmatism, to make the capitulation look like the only reasonable path forward. And it was not limited to Burkina Faso. The intercepted communications revealed the same operation running simultaneously across the Sahel. Mali's Ministry of Mines had already approved 3 uranium contracts through a compromised official. Niger's oil minister was cooperating. Ghana's gold export chain was 70% controlled by the network's partner corporations. Traoré was not just the target of this operation. He was the last significant obstacle to its completion across the entire region. That is what made this so much bigger than one man's betrayal. Abuja's strategist had explained the philosophy plainly in one of the recordings. The elegance of this approach is that African leaders appear to destroy themselves. When the contracts are signed, when the resources are extracted, when the profits flow to London and New York, it looks like African decisions freely made. No colonizer visible, no occupation declared. Just business, just investment, just development partnerships, and that is how 5 centuries of extraction continues in the 21st century, not as conquest, as commerce. Diabate had convinced himself he was being realistic, that accommodation was survival, that negotiating with the corporations was smarter than resisting them. The recordings captured him coaching himself through the betrayal. Traoré doesn't understand the forces we're fighting. I was trying to find a way through. A way for Burkina Faso to survive rather than be crushed by isolation. But survival in Diabate's calculation meant surrendering 60% of the nation's gold production within 2 years. It meant foreign workers employed under security pretexts. It meant profits routed through offshore accounts while environmental destruction stayed behind. It meant Burkina Faso as a managed territory of foreign extraction, its government left in place as decoration, its president left in position as a useful face on a body that no longer controlled its own economy. That was the survival Diabate was negotiating. And he thought Traoré would never know. At midnight, the security teams moved. Diabate was still on an encrypted call to Lagos, confirming that tomorrow's cabinet meeting would finalize the new resource policy. He had convinced himself the final step was days away. He was speaking with full confidence, unaware that every word was being captured in real time by the same intelligence apparatus he had spent 3 years trying to corrupt. Tomorrow, the cabinet meeting will finalize it. Diabate's voice was calm. I have prepared the president for limited foreign partnerships. He believes this is necessary for economic stability. Abuja can begin operations within the week. The security team surrounded the residence. Captain Woodrow's voice came through Traoré's earpiece. Target confirmed. Alone. Still on the call. Awaiting your command. Move in, Traoré said. Bring him to the palace. They brought him in handcuffs, his phone still warm from the call to Lagos. The man who had attended every classified briefing, who had helped plan Burkina Faso's resistance strategy, who had stood beside Traoré at press conferences speaking about African dignity, that man now stood on the other side of the presidential desk with the full evidence of his treason spread out before him. Traoré did not shout. He did not need to. The recording spoke, the photograph spoke, the bank record spoke. Everything Diabate had built his deception on was now laid open under the lights of the presidential office. 3 years of planning Burkina Faso's economic colonization. Traoré's voice was controlled and absolute. 3 years of sitting beside me in the meetings you were secretly recording. 3 years of serving Tinubu's agenda while wearing the face of a patriot. Diabate tried the last argument of every exposed collaborator. He tried to reframe his betrayal as strategy. Ibrahim, you don't understand the forces aligned against us. France, Nigeria, the mining corporations, they have unlimited resources. I was trying to find a way for you to survive this pressure, to negotiate from a position that doesn't end with Burkina Faso destroyed. Survive. Traoré's voice turned sharp as cut steel. You call selling our mineral reserves survival. You call opening our security files to foreign corporation survival. You call accepting colonial economic structures and dressing them up as investment survival. Say that word again, Mamadou. Say it to the people whose gold you were selling. Say it to the children whose future you auctioned for $50,000 a month. Diabate's composure cracked. The military bearing dissolved. The rationalizations fell away. What was left was a man confronting the full weight of what he had done. Traoré was not finished. This is exactly how they took Lumumba, not with bullets first, with a trusted face. Mobutu sat beside him, believed in by him, then used against him. They did the same thing to Sankara. They found someone close enough to be trusted and turned that trust into a weapon. Compaoré did not need a foreign army. He was the army. And now they tried to use you to finish what generations of colonial strategy could not. To turn Burkina Faso's resistance into willing service of their mineral empires. He stepped back. His voice dropped lower. You made one fatal error, Mamadou. You forgot that I am not Lumumba, trusting until the end. I am not Sankara, believing brotherhood conquers greed. I am Ibrahim Traoré, and I learned everything from their martyrdom. Captain Ouedraogo entered with 4 soldiers. Traoré delivered the judgment with the weight of a man who understood that this moment was larger than any personal betrayal. Colonel Mamadou Diabate, you are stripped of all military rank, expelled from the armed forces of Burkina Faso, sentenced as a traitor to the state. Your citizenship is revoked. Your assets are confiscated. You have 6 hours to leave our soil permanently. The military medals came off the uniform. They hit the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the whole building. The sound of colonial collaboration meeting its consequence. As the soldiers led Diabaté toward the door, Traoré spoke past him, into the air, into the continent, into every capital and every boardroom that was part of this network. Tell Tinubu his colonial games end in Burkina Faso. Tell Abuja that our gold stays in our hands. Tell every foreign corporation waiting to move in that the age of African betrayal is over. The door closed. Within hours, the news moved across West Africa faster than any official statement could contain it. Traoré had arrested his own national security advisor for treason. He had exposed a multinational corporate conspiracy targeting Burkina Faso's gold reserves. He had named Tinubu's involvement publicly. He had broadcast intercepted recordings as evidence. The reaction was immediate and continental. In Lagos, Tinubu received the intelligence reports with visible alarm. His carefully constructed network of regional assets, built over years of careful coordination with mining interests and Western financial institutions, was being exposed in real time to millions of Africans who had long suspected that such networks existed but never had evidence this direct, this clear, this loud. In London and New York, Abuja executives began canceling expansion plans. The projected timelines for West African operations were pulled back. The political risk calculation had changed overnight. When an African president arrests his own security advisor and plays the recordings of foreign coordination on national television, the message to every corporate boardroom is unmistakable. The era of low-cost infiltration in this region is over. Across the Sahel, something else began happening. Government officials in neighboring countries, men who had received similar approaches, similar payments, similar promises of protection, began to understand their exposure. Confessions moved quietly. Ties with mining coordination networks were severed. The fear that Burkina Faso's intelligence files contained more than just Diabaté's records began driving decisions in offices that had never considered consequence before. Traoré's televised address to the nation did not soften anything. He stood before the cameras with Diabaté's confiscated documents visible behind him, and spoke with the directness of a man who had decided that clarity was more powerful than diplomacy. This is how modern colonialism functions. They do not send gunboats, they send businessmen with briefcases. They do not install governors. They install compromised advisors who look African, speak African, but serve European and American extraction interests. They find our trusted officials and they buy them. They buy their access. They buy their loyalty. They buy their silence. And then they use those men to buy our nations. He held up the Abuja Continental Strategy documents. Operations active in 12 countries simultaneously. The same structure, the same promises, the same extraction pipeline disguised as partnership and development. Let every capital from Dakar to Nairobi understand this clearly. Burkina Faso is not for sale. Our minerals are not investment opportunities for those who kept our grandparents in chains. Our sovereignty is not a negotiating position, and any man who tries to sell what belongs to our people will face the same justice Colonel Diabaté faced. Swift, certain, without appeal. 3 days later, 30,000 people filled the stadium in Ouagadougou. Traoré stood before them and gave the address that would be replayed across West Africa for weeks. He showed the photographs on giant screens, Diabaté with Abuja executives in Dubai, Diabaté in Lagos, the wire transfer records, the coordination calls, the three-phase strategy for turning Burkina Faso's goldfields into foreign property. He let the evidence speak first, and then he spoke about what it meant. This is not a story about one man's greed. This is a story about Africa's oldest wound. They have always found someone on the inside. They have always found someone willing to trade the future of his people for the comfort of his family. From colonial governors who used African assistants to manage the occupation, to corporations that use compromised ministers to sign extraction agreements, the method has never changed. Only the salaries got bigger. Only the promises got smoother. But the people in that stadium did not just hear a speech about history. They heard something more urgent. They heard that the resistance they had believed in was real, that the sovereignty they had been told was impossible was being defended, that the continental awakening many had written off as rhetoric was happening right now with consequences. The message reached the presidential offices that Traoré wanted it to reach. In every government across the Sahel where similar operations had been running, officials who had believed their arrangements were invisible now understood they were not. The architecture of compromise that had seemed so stable, so permanent, so professionally constructed, had been dismantled publicly in Ouagadougou by a president who simply refused to accept the assumption that betrayal from within was inevitable. That assumption, perhaps, was the most important thing Traoré destroyed. Because what had kept the colonial extraction system running for so long was not just corruption. It was the belief that corruption was the only realistic path, that accommodation was inevitable. That sovereignty was a speech you gave on Independence Day, and then quietly abandoned in the boardroom. That African leaders who tried to actually hold the line would be isolated, destabilized, and replaced by someone more cooperative. The belief that the system was too powerful to resist from inside made the system self-reinforcing. Compromised officials did not see themselves as traitors. They saw themselves as survivors. Traoré had just proven that the system could be resisted, that betrayal could be detected, that justice could be delivered, that the machinery of foreign infiltration, however sophisticated, however well-funded, however carefully placed, was not invisible to a government that was actually looking for it. And across Africa, more people were beginning to look. But the story did not end in Ouagadougou. That is what Tinubu and his network had not calculated. Because when you expose a system this publicly, you do not just punish one traitor. You change the entire landscape of possibility. You show every compromised official across the continent that the protection they were promised is not real. You show every corporate executive that the arrangements they considered permanent can be unwound overnight. You show every foreign government that the proxies they fund can turn into liabilities the moment one African president decides to stop pretending he does not know what is happening. The ripple moved fast. Within 72 hours of Traoré's televised address, 3 other West African governments quietly announced internal reviews of their mining contracts. None of them named Burkina Faso directly. None of them admitted that the review was connected to Diabaté's arrest, but the timing was not coincidental. When you see a man arrested with this level of documented evidence, and you know your own files contain similar arrangements, you move quickly and you move quietly. In Paris, French officials, who had long managed West African resource policy through a network of corporate partners and cooperative governments, began reassessing their exposure. The Abuja connection ran through French financial institutions. Several of the shell companies identified in Traoré's evidence had registered addresses in Paris and Geneva. French media largely ignored the story, but French government offices did not ignore it. Behind closed doors, the conversation was urgent. In Washington, analysts at think tanks funded by energy and mining interests began producing assessments of Traoré's move. Their framing was predictable. They called it authoritarian consolidation. They called it a threat to foreign investment confidence. They called it destabilizing. What they could not call it was wrong, because the recordings were real, the payments were real, the coordination was real, and no amount of analytical reframing could make documented evidence disappear. That is what exposed the deeper contradiction at the heart of Western commentary on African governance. When African leaders arrest political opponents on thin evidence, Western governments issue statements about rule of law and democratic norms. But when an African president arrests his security advisor with intercepted recordings, corporate documents, and bank transfer records as evidence, those same governments go quiet. Because the evidence does not just indict Diabaté, it indicts the system those governments have spent decades protecting. Traoré understood this. That is why he broadcast everything. He did not hold a quiet tribunal. He did not manage the story through controlled leaks. He put the recordings on television. He put the photographs on giant screens in a packed stadium. He made the evidence public, because public evidence cannot be quietly managed away by the interests it exposes. He understood that visibility was the most powerful weapon he had, and he used it without hesitation. Back in the Sahel, the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES bloc that Burkina Faso shares with Mali and Niger, responded with a statement that carried unmistakable significance. The bloc affirmed Burkina Faso's right to prosecute enemies of its sovereignty, regardless of their rank or their former proximity to power. The language was diplomatic, but the meaning was direct. The AES was closing ranks. The message to anyone still operating compromised networks inside AES governments was clear. The umbrella of protection you believed you had does not exist. Mali's transitional government went further. Within days of Traoré's address, Bamako announced the suspension of 3 foreign mining agreements pending review. The official reason given was environmental compliance. But observers across the region understood what the review was actually looking for. And the corporations whose agreements were suspended understood it too. 2 of them had ties to the same Abuja network exposed in Ouagadougou. This is what cascading accountability looks like when it actually happens in African politics. It does not announce itself with grand declarations. It moves through quiet reviews and suspended agreements and officials who stop returning certain phone calls. It is less dramatic than a stadium speech, but it is more consequential, because it means the operating environment for foreign extraction networks has actually changed, not just rhetorically, but practically. Tinubu watched all of this from Lagos with a political problem that had no clean solution. He could not publicly respond to Traore's allegations without confirming that the relationship between his office and Abuja was worth responding to. He could not stay silent without appearing to confirm that the recordings said what they clearly said. He could not claim the recordings were fabricated because too many details within them were verifiable through independent sources. And he could not appeal to ECOWAS to pressure Burkina Faso, because any such appeal would draw more attention to exactly the kind of interference the recordings documented. So he chose the option all cornered political operators choose when every door is closed. He said nothing and hoped the news cycle would move on. It did not move on, it deepened. African journalists who had spent years trying to document corporate political coordination in West African resource sectors now had a publicly confirmed framework to work from. The names, the methods, the shell company structures, the coordination between Lagos political offices and London corporate headquarters, all of it was now documented and public. Investigative teams across Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire began pulling threads connected to the same network. The stories that came back confirmed what many had long suspected but never been able to fully document. The Abuja operation in Burkina Faso was not an isolated arrangement. It was one visible node in a continental infrastructure of corporate political coordination that had been running quietly for years. The same methods, the same financial structures, the same promises made to the same kinds of officials. The exposure in Ouagadougou had not just revealed one conspiracy. It had provided the map for understanding dozens of others. That is what Tinubu had truly underestimated. He had treated Traoré as a regional problem, a stubborn leader who needed to be managed into compliance through economic pressure and internal compromise. He had not considered the possibility that Traoré would respond to betrayal not by retreating, but by going on offense, by making the private public, by turning a security crisis into a continental political moment. And now the map was visible, and people across Africa were reading it. That is what made this so much larger than one man's betrayal, or one president's response. This was about whether the infrastructure of neo-colonial economic control could survive public exposure, whether the system that had managed African resources for decades could continue operating when its methods were documented, named, and broadcast to millions of people who had lived under its consequences their entire lives. The answer Ouagadougou was giving, slowly and then all at once, was no. Not because one operation was shut down, not because one advisor was arrested, but because the willingness to look directly at the system, to name it publicly without diplomatic softening, to show the evidence and trust the people with the truth, that willingness was spreading. And a system built on the assumption that African governments would always manage these things quietly, always protect the arrangements, always choose access over accountability. That system had no defense against a government that simply refused to play by those rules. Ibrahim Traoré's closest ally had betrayed him for Abuja. The president showed no mercy, and in doing so, he showed something the continent needed to see, that the Africa they had spent centuries trying to own, trying to manage, trying to reduce to a resource base for foreign prosperity, was capable of looking directly at what had been done to it, naming it without flinching, and refusing to accept it as permanent. The struggle was not over. It would not be over for a long time. The corporations would regroup. The networks would adapt. The pressure on Burkina Faso would not disappear because one operation was exposed. New approaches would be designed. New faces would be recruited. New arrangements would be proposed with smoother language and more sophisticated legal structures. But something had shifted that could not be shifted back. The assumption of African silence had been broken. The belief that these systems could operate indefinitely without consequence had been punctured. The comfort that foreign interests had long enjoyed. The comfort of knowing that even when their arrangements were suspected, they would never be publicly confirmed by an African head of state. That comfort was gone. Africa was watching. The people were watching. And more leaders, slowly, were beginning to understand that the watching had consequences. The age of quiet surrender was ending. What came next was not yet clear, but it was coming, and it would not arrive quietly.